For nearly 2 months now, we have been telling you about the crisis unfolding in Afghanistan. Food prices are soaring, unemployment is rising, and all this amid terror attacks in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. And now the G20 leaders have pledged more than $1 billion in aid to the country. Welcome to WION World is One. My name is Priyanka Sharma, and on this special broadcast of the WION VOA co-production, we'll tell you more about this G20 pledge. Let's get started now. Members of the G20 group of industrialized nations have pledged more than $1 billion in aid to prevent a catastrophe in Afghanistan. Following an emergency meeting on Tuesday, Henry Ridgwell brings us more details in this next report for Voice of America.
Winter is fast approaching in Afghanistan and temperatures are falling. Aid agencies say millions of people need urgent assistance.
We are expecting around 3 million children to suffer from acute malnutrition, amongst them 1 million who will be literally fighting for their lives as they need treatment for severe acute malnutrition.
The United Nations says Afghanistan needs billions of dollars to rescue its economy and avert a catastrophe. Members of the G20 held an emergency virtual meeting Tuesday to discuss the crisis.
It is the first time that leaders have given a multilateral response to the Afghan crisis. A consensus was found for the need for Afghanistan not to be allowed to return to being a kind of refuge for international terrorists.
The European Union pledged $1.2 billion for Afghanistan and its neighbours. The aid will be channeled through international organisations working on the ground. The United States has already pledged $330 million so far this year. President Joe Biden told the G20 meeting that aid money should not be given to the Taliban. Germany's leader said there can be no recognition of the militant group as long as it denies basic rights to women and girls.
I have said this very clearly. The Taliban government is not inclusive. That is why the issue of recognizing the Taliban is not on the agenda. Nevertheless, there must and should be talks, as are now increasingly taking place.
The Taliban said Tuesday the international community should normalize relations.
All options of force and pressure were used, but to no avail. Now we have to use the options of negotiation and understanding.
For ordinary Afghans, life is getting harder. There is a desperate shortage of cash. Many businesses have closed, leading to job losses. Salaries are not being paid. The price of basic goods has increased sharply, the result of years of conflict and severe drought.
It is now a matter of life and death for many of these children who are severely acutely malnourished. So what we hope for within the humanitarian community, within UNICEF, is that the humanitarian aid provided to families, children and mothers is depoliticized. That we first look at the humanitarian imperative, the urgent needs of these children firstly, and then try and figure out the larger systems and how they will work.
Taliban and Western government officials are holding talks in Qatar on allowing aid into the country and letting refugees out. Meanwhile, G20 leaders are due to meet again face-to-face in Rome at the end of the month. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
To speak about this further, we're now joined by Voice of America correspondent Chris Casquejo from Washington. Chris, thanks for joining us on this special broadcast. Now, most of the G20 leaders attended the virtual summit to discuss Afghanistan's growing humanitarian crisis. As of now, there isn't a concrete plan to distribute these funds that the G20 has pledged. What are the implications for regional security if there's a total economic collapse?
Word refugees. The G20 leaders are pouring money into Afghanistan because they don't want its humanitarian crisis to turn into a refugee crisis, with millions of Afghans showing up at their borders. Turkish President Erdogan gave a videotaped speech to the summit. He said Turkey simply can't handle an influx of migrants from Afghanistan because it already hosts 3.6 million Syrian refugees. Prime Minister Modi, of course, did attend the G session on Afghanistan. We know that India has already poured nearly $3 billion into stabilizing Afghanistan. Certainly, India and the rest of the world are worried about security for their aid workers going forward. For example, the Taliban's acting Minister of Information told VOA in an interview that China wants to invest billions of dollars in Afghanistan, but only if the Taliban can guarantee security for their workers and their assets. The G20 has been very worried about the rise of ISIS-K or Daesh in Afghanistan. The Taliban spokesperson also told VOA the group is committed to eliminating them but has not said how. President Biden says the U.S. can fight terrorists using what it calls over-the-horizon capabilities, but it's unclear whether those will be effective since they don't rely on boots on the ground. In fact, the U.S. has already accidentally killed an aid worker and his family with a drone strike in a tragic case of mistaken identity.
Right. Now, Chris, it appears that the G20 has agreed that they must work with the Taliban in some form or the other. What kind of position does that leave Washington in, given that the Biden administration has said that it won't officially recognize the Taliban?
Well, it likely leaves Washington with no choice but to deal with the Taliban at some level, even though it won't officially recognize them as Afghanistan's government. The U.S. admitted it coordinated with the Taliban to evacuate American citizens and Afghan allies after the previous Afghan government collapsed this summer. President Biden has insisted that any aid to the Afghan people be distributed through non-governmental organizations or NGOs. And he hasn't shown any sign that the U.S. and its allies will unfreeze Afghanistan's reserve funds. The Taliban's Minister of Information claims negotiations are ongoing with the U.S. and other countries and international banks as well. He called this money crucial to solving the economic problems of the Afghan people. Experts believe it's only a matter of time before China officially recognizes the Taliban, but think about the optics of that as China has brutally and systematically suppressed its own Muslim Uyghur population.
Right, Chris, thanks so much for these inputs. Stay with us on this broadcast. We'd like to get your inputs on another story. Now, more than 70 zoos in the United States are gearing up to inoculate some of their animals against COVID-19 amid a rise in cases. Voice of America gets us more details in the vaccine's effectiveness for the animals and which species will get the jab first. Take a look.
9 big cats at the Smithsonian's National Zoo tested presumptive positive for the virus that causes COVID-19 in September. Fortunately, they are now eating and behaving normally after receiving treatment for secondary bacterial infections.
There's not a treatment for COVID itself, so our veterinarians started treating with antibiotics. There were pain meds given and anti-nausea and appetite stimulant.
How the felines got infected is still unknown.
The most likely scenario is that an asymptomatic staff member would have passed this along. It's an airborne virus, and so things do get out around your masks.
Other species, such as primates, are testing positive for COVID-19 in zoos across the U.S. The Washington, D.C. and Baltimore zoos are among those gearing up to use an available experimental COVID vaccine to boost the immunity of their at-risk animals. Cheetah are one of the endangered species that will get vaccinated against COVID-19 before the end of the year at the Maryland Zoo. It should be a smooth process, since many of the animals at this facility are already trained by technicians to receive injections on a routine basis.
Something like a stick at first to just push a little bit on the animal for some pressure, and then they move to something like a needle with a cap on it, and then they'll move up to an actual injection. So there are multiple steps to get them to the point that they're voluntarily training for that procedure.
The pharmaceutical company Zoetis is donating over 11,000 doses of its COVID-19 vaccine to zoos nationwide. The company says the vaccine has proven to be safe in dogs, cats, and minks. But since it hasn't been tested in zoo animals, it's hard to say yet if they'll be protected, particularly against the Delta variant, and for how long.
Giving them 2 doses, you at least reduce the risk of exposure. The groups that receive the experimental vaccine have an obligation to report back to us and the USDA the disposition of those vaccines and what happened to those animals.
On October 7th, a snow leopard that had shown COVID-19 symptoms died at the Great Plains Zoo in South Dakota. A necropsy will determine the cause of death. Given the large number of visitors at zoos nationwide, questions have been raised over whether COVID-19 infections among the animals could pose a public health risk.
Probably not, because the population is small, so the infection will self-extinguish. meaning the animals will recover or they will die. At the end of the clinical trial, if there are infections in unvaccinated zoos and not in vaccinated zoos, we will have some evidence of the potency of the vaccine.
Staffers at the Maryland Zoo are hopeful the vaccine will indeed provide an extra layer of protection against COVID-19, especially for several species which are already listed as endangered.
Losing an animal in a zoo, there's always an impact. They're valuable to the breeding programs, they're valuable to the troop that they're in, the group that they're in, so obviously it would have a big impact on us.
Veronica Valderas Iglesias for VOA News at the Maryland Zoo in Baltimore.
For more on this, we still have Voice of America's correspondent Chris Casquejo from Washington with us. Chris, thanks for staying with us. Now, while the U.S. will begin vaccinating zoo animals, the World Health Organization made some new recommendations about vaccines for humans earlier this week. So what is the U.S. doing to help ensure that people remain the priority globally?
Priyanka, the U.S. recently donated 3.5 million Pfizer vaccine doses through Nigeria through COVAX, the WHO partnership that distributes vaccines worldwide. That brings the total of pledged U.S. vaccine doses through COVAX to more than 1 billion. The WHO says there should be enough vaccine to inoculate 70% of the planet if major economies stop doing two things: giving boosters and stockpiling extra doses. WHO experts say this is the only way to prevent the growing number of COVID-19 variants from spreading and making the existing vaccines less effective.
Right, Chris, my final question for you. The World Health Organization wants the U.S. and other wealthy nations not to stockpile vaccine doses, but the WHO is recommending an additional dose of the vaccine. How does this differ from booster shots?
Well, the WHO experts recommend this additional dose, but they're not calling it a booster shot. And they're only recommending it for the immunosuppressed, like cancer survivors. And the shots should come 1 to 3 months after the last dose people have received their last shots. Booster shots are recommended 6 months after the last dose, and the idea is that everyone who's been fully vaccinated should get one. This same group of expert advisors to the WHO will meet again next month to discuss booster shots. Meanwhile, the U.S. is going ahead with the approval process for Moderna and Johnson & Johnson vaccine boosters. Recommendations about which groups of people should receive those Moderna and J&J boosters could come next week. As other nations decide who will get boosters, only 20% of India is fully vaccinated, while half of the population has received at least one dose.
Right, Chris, thanks so much for all those inputs, and thank you for joining us on this broadcast.